public health fields utilize this framework. And we really like it because, as you can see from the left side, it helps us really frame how prevention can be individually focused all the way across the continuum to community level change that we often call environmental change. So I want to just briefly look through each of these. Know that when Derek does send out follow-up emails, he's going to send you a handout with this spectrum, and it will include some descriptions of each. But as we take a look, we know that we need to do the work to strengthen individual knowledge and skills, and that's really the core level of prevention that's been most strongly funded over the years, where we're helping with knowledge and attitudes and skill development and behavior change. At level 2, we're promoting community education, so we're reaching more out to groups of people and not just individuals, and looking at building some capacity, usually also with possibly some parents that may be gatekeepers for kids, or with workplaces that are then the gatekeepers for their employees. And then educating providers takes that even further, where maybe you're doing some training of trainers for some key folks in key positions. And then as we work to foster coalitions and networks and get more community ownership of the solution and get everybody's hands on deck. At level 5, we're then working together to change organizational practices. Maybe there's some memorandums of understanding between two systems that work better and make services more accessible. Maybe a college campus creates a memorandum of understanding with their campus police, working closely with the county local police. Those kinds of organizational practices that make things move smoothly. And then influencing policy and legislation. And I want to back up that the organizational practices can also include some policy work at more of an organizational level, like an athletic code of conduct, those kinds of things. And then influencing the policy and the legislation is more of that local ordinance to state law all the way up to national laws. So as we look at those strategies across that full spectrum, we need to be mindful within the work that we do that we need to be based in the research for all of that. And where scare tactics probably get used the most is in those lower levels on that grid, especially in level 1 and 2. So I want to focus us in now on scare tactics and just really ask, what do we really even mean by a scare tactic? So I'm going to ask you to use your question box. Chat would also be okay, but I prefer the question box, just so there's one place for us to look on this end. And I'm just wondering if you guys could throw out some examples of when you hear the term scare tactic, what would be an example of a scare tactic? Let's see what you come up with. Faces of meth. This is your brain on drugs with the egg in the pan. The mock crashes before prom. Seen a lot of that. Pushing the coffin out onto the high school assembly floor. The gory images, the crash videos, often in driver training courses, taking kids to the jail cells, doing the ghost project where you pull kids out. I think that some people call that death day. Scared straight, hear that one an awful lot. Things that show the meth mouth. So you guys came up with, thank you, a really great number of examples. And as we look at that, I want to go ahead and kind of summarize. I saw a lot of graphic warnings, a lot of things related to graphic imaging. Didn't see too many talks about scary stories that may be told by often a recovering addict or a big keynote speaker. Tragic consequences told by other people who've been impacted maybe by someone else's use. Maybe they were hit by a drunk driver, they've lost a family member to alcohol and other drugs. So there are a lot of different things that people kick around when they're talking about scare tactics. And what we noticed is no one was really doing a lot of work to define what a scare tactic really means. So as we look, I want to propose a definition emphasizing the worst dangers of drug use in order to create fear and anxiety, and this is the key piece, in hopes that the fear alone will prevent or stop risky behaviors. Basically, the belief that if we just scare them and scare them some more, then they won't do these things. I feel like across all my years in prevention, that's the tightest definition and the key that I've seen. And the key to this is really this basis, excuse me, that the fear alone is going to really be the linchpin of change. So let's take a look more at these fear-based approaches. And first off, I just want to be real clear that it makes sense to me that folks use them, because as adults, they make sense to us. Because adults apply logic, rational thinking, and have a lot of life experience to go, wow, when we see these negative things happen, we know they really can happen, and they happen more than in this one occasion. And wow, if that's going to happen, then no, we wouldn't make that choice. So they have a very strong intuitive appeal. And they're very tempting, particularly because they seem very powerful, and our guts just really tell us that it'll work. Because if they only knew what could happen, they clearly would never do this. We also know that scare tactics get used not just around alcohol and other drugs, but all kinds of issues, and they get used by parents a lot. I'm sure you guys can finish these sentences as I say them. Don't sit too close to the TV, you'll go blind. Don't cross your eyes, they'll stay that way. This has been going on since I was a kid, right? Parents seem obsessed with vision for some reason here. So the go-to approach by youth leaders is another thing that I see, and a lot of folks go, well, you know, in youth-led prevention, youth really know their peers. They know what will work with their peers. They don't necessarily know what will work for their peers. They guess at what they think may work for their peers, but they don't know all the research either. And in youth-led prevention, we have to marry their perceptions and insights with the research, and that's why there's always an adult advisor who's also the guide on the side, helping to train them and build their capacity so they don't reinvent a bad wheel. I have a great example. I was working with a community here in Ohio that was hosting a weekend middle school camp, and the high school youth staff that were on the planning committee in the month prior to the camp had written a 3-act play that would evolve over the weekend, so that there were a couple of small discussion groups called family groups that would happen in between, and some workshops and other things that happened in between. In this 3-act play, it ended up showing the lead up to, and then the party, and then all the things after the party. And in this one party, 5 kids died, all in one night. And one of them died after making the right choice, felt uncomfortable at the party, and walked away and was walking home when another kid left and drove and ran over that kid. So, I mean, it was just like death and destruction everywhere. So even the kid who made the positive choice, in the end, it ended in tragedy. So it was just like, you know, sticking the knife in and twisting it, and really getting the emotions all churned up. And it made sense to the youth that that's, for some reason, the message they thought they needed to do. So the staff asked me to come in and sit down with the youth staff and just process with them, you know, how often does that much happen at any one party? Even if somebody dies, how often is it really 5? And how many parties happen where nobody dies? And what other kinds of things can be negative consequences from use? And could we take this down a couple notches and really show some of the other consequences that kids also relate to more? And they ended up coming up with some really great things where, like, a girlfriend and a boyfriend were fighting over how much he was drinking, and she was feeling ignored, and she felt like he'd made promises and that he was breaking with her, and that the relationship wasn't where she wanted it to be. And they showed the aftermath more about the next day at school, where one kid was hungover and he didn't do well on his test. And things that are much more relatable in the short term to kids and weren't as full of scare tactics. So sometimes kids need our guidance, and hopefully today's webinar will help you to provide them with that guidance and show them that research piece. Now, because it has such strong intuitive appeal, and we are all human, and we believe fear is the way to go, we have a very long history of scare tactics. Someone already mentioned when we were typing them all in that here's your brain on drugs, and there's our egg in the pan. But this goes back way before that, all the way back to the temperance movement, way before Prohibition. You know, 50 and 100 years before Prohibition, the temperance movement was already in full swing. And in that temperance movement, there are museum documents that show tales told for the cause, and interviews with people who said, I told many tales for the cause. So tales of spontaneous internal combustion from drinking that hellfire water, that demon rum, right? People bursting into flames. Certainly we have a very long history with this. We also, if any of you have seen it, know that 1930s, the government, not the government, but somebody put out the reefer madness, and that it even equated marijuana as a narcotic, and crazy things happened. If you've never watched that movie, it's worth getting it for $4 or $5 on Amazon. What's even more worth it is really reading the customer reviews. It's become a thing where people watch it now while high, so that's kind of become a thing. But and that says a lot, that they make fun of it. They now host parties where they watch Reefer Madness while they get high. So that speaks to a little bit of where we're at. But it ruined a lot of credibility for preventionists that followed that Reefer Madness headset. Of course, in the 1970s, we had Scared Straight. Of course, we still have it today because it's back on cable TV, and A&E has their show Intervention, and in some communities, Scared Straight never went away because, you know, there's a lot of taking kids down to the jail and giving them a tour and having them talk with folks. The 1980s, that's more my generation, we had Dave Toma, and he would come around. If anyone ever saw him speak or read his book, he would just put out the most extreme stories. I still remember stories of people sticking knitting needles in their eye or jumping out of windows under the influence of PCP. And then there's always my 8th grade health teacher who told us all that young men in puberty who smoke marijuana will grow breasts. So, of course, we're all sitting around my 8th grade class trying to get a side view on all the hoods that would go out, you know, in the back of the gym at lunch, and, you know, we're trying to see if there was anything there, and we weren't seeing anything. And then, of course, all the girls were thinking, what? You know, hey, does this work for girls? You know, because that Judy Blume method not working for me. Any guys on the line? I'm sorry, you'll have to talk with someone in your life who's a female to understand what the Judy Blume method is. So you'll have to ask a female in your life about that one. All right, so as we talk about, you know, this young men in puberty smoking marijuana will grow breasts, there is some very small scientific, there's some reality there, but they overstated it, implying that it happens to every kid who smokes weed. It can happen to kids at certain key times in their development smoking heavily enough, and then still not to everybody. So, you know, it's important that sometimes, there can be truth, but again, we're relying on the fear to carry the day. And when it doesn't hold up against personal experience, it starts to create a real credibility issue, not only for that current message giver, but all the message givers to follow. But that only got us through the 80s. In the 90s, here was the fun one. I was working at the Columbus Health Department at the time, and ecstasy was making its big comeback. And there was all this talk that ecstasy causes holes in the brain. And as I tried to peel that back, because, I mean, you hear that, and people, you know, kids hear that, adults hear that, you know, they're thinking flesh-eating virus kind of actual physiological holes in the brain. When you peel it back, it's a complete misstatement, and what it was with all the new brain imaging and scanning and the PET scans and all these things where you can see when the brain is in play and functioning and people are being scanned doing tasks, you see the firing and the lighting up of the brain, and there were these dark spots of inactivity. And someone, somewhere along the way, referred to that as holes, and it got picked up, and, you know, people were like hungry for anything that would scare kids away from ecstasy, implying there were Swiss cheese brains out there physiologically, which is a complete misstatement of the actual science. But people were hungry to try to prevent the use of ecstasy, so they lobbed on to the first thing they heard that sounded scary. 2001, we certainly had everything following 9/11, and there were a lot of commercials about drug use supporting terrorism. Not saying it's not true. Not saying that you know, the poppy fields in Afghanistan certainly aren't a problem. Again, some of these things can be exaggerations. Some can be outright lies. Some can be total truth. The key is whether they're relying on fear as the way to get through the message. Here in Ohio, I know in the mid-2000s we had to really fight off a campaign by a pharmaceutical company who was trying to make good on their manufacture of OxyContin, and you know, trying to do the right thing to get a prevention program out there free and cheap to the schools, and a number of other communities, particularly in the Midwest and around the Ohio River Valley, that were really being hit hard with the issue in this early days of our opiate crisis. Were hungry for anything. But when you looked at this campaign, it was just chock full of scare tactics and other really ill-advised and non-research-based content. And so there was an awful lot of work to try to keep that out, because schools wanted it because it was free. And it was specific to a crisis they were facing. So we know that we have a history here. And it doesn't stop the reality just because there's research that there aren't still, even pretty official and sometimes pretty governmental, strategies that get really based in scare tactics. And again, some of it's our natural human tendency to think this is what will work, even though the research shows again and again that these are not only ineffective strategies, but they can even backfire. And we're going to take a look at what we mean by backfiring in just a minute. So there is a ton of research against. On that slide is just a smattering of a listing. There's over 60 years of research. Derek is also, as part of the follow-up email, going to send you the list of studies that were used in the creation of our scare tactics document. So you will have the citations for this webinar. Those will be coming to you. I will say that in this research, sometimes there were short-term effects in the right direction. But again, short-term. Any positive impact that was found when a scare tactic was used was found to be very short-lived and didn't carry to the moment of choice. And we're going to look at why here as we dig into our 4 reasons why. Before we do, one of the most recent lit reviews was done by the National Institute of Health Science panel in 2004, and I know that's 10 years ago. It feels like about every 10 years people have to put something out that says, look, these don't work. So that was the one 10 years ago. And one of their quotes out of their summary is there on the screen for you, that programs that rely on scare tactics to prevent problems are not only ineffective, but may have damaging effects. Again, that backfire effect. So we're going to take a look at 4 reasons why scare tactics don't work. And let's go ahead and take a look at number 1 here. One of the core reasons is that youth often dismiss these messages as a defense to the feeling of fear. They are not alone in this. This happens across all ages, developmentally. Human beings, when faced with a message that brings up fear for them, we go to common human defenses like denial. Yeah, but that could never happen to me, or that won't happen to my kid, or that's not in my neighborhood, right? So kids get the it can't happen to me. And it's a way for us to, when we have this extreme fear, to try to manage it or take the edge off of it or disassociate from it. Another common one can be countering it with skepticism. And this is what kids do very often, like the kids in my 8th grade health class. You know, I know people who do that and they seem fine, or they don't have breaths from their marijuana, or, you know, so we look around and we go, I know people who do it and they seem okay. And so that impacts, again, the credibility of the current message giver as well as future message givers. Another example would be avoidance. Sometimes people just simply ignore the message because it becomes too scary to think about, so they kind of just shut down about it. We see that a lot with women and breast cancer. That was in a number of the studies as I was researching this, that there's a reason, even when it's in the family history, that women still avoid the mammogram, even when they're of age to, or even after they themselves have fell a lump, because it's just too scary to think about, and so they ignore or avoid it. It's a very common human response to fear. Another one is that sometimes there's a lot of making fun of the message. And we have heard story after story of that, particularly when it comes to something like the mock crashes around prom. The adults are very invested in all this cross-system collaboration that's really important and amazing, but the actual message very often gets made fun of by kids because, again, it's a way for them to manage the fear response. The research tells us that you can't arouse fear, and I want to let you know that fear can be a natural response of telling the truth, of negative consequences. And it's not saying don't share negative consequences, but you don't share them in a vacuum, all right? And we're going to give you some other tips about this as we go today. The key is there have to be clear action steps about what to do. And the action step can't be don't do drugs, drugs are bad. The action step can't just be don't do it. What not to do is not an action step. Kids need an opportunity to practice skills and behaviors like decision-making, coping, resistance skills. You're not going to get that in a 15, 30, 45-minute, hour-long assembly presentation full of scare tactics, right? There's no context of age-appropriate, comprehensive programming that's interactive and skill-based to give them the decision-making, coping, and resistance skills, as well as balancing that message with a lot of other things that we're going to talk about as we go through all 4 reasons. Let me go ahead and jump to reason 2 as we put all this together. This is a very important one. Youth have a different filter than adults. One, they have less life experience, so they don't have context for the permanence of the consequences of their choices, and that's why they think they're invincible and immortal, right? They can play video games and get desensitized and not see things as permanent. So there's just first and foremost the life experience thing. They may be hearing a negative consequence for the first time, and they don't have a container for it to see how often that it may happen and go, this is one occasion I've heard of, but I know there have been more. They only hear the one and go, well, but that won't happen to me, right? Because I'm smarter than that, or all the things they fill in. The other very important piece of this is the more we're learning about the brain and the brain development, the more it's very clear why scare tactics don't work, especially with kids. Adults can see how a choice can lead to dire consequences. They use their logic and rational thinking, their impulse control, their judgment, their decision making, and they don't do it. But youth, their prefrontal cortex is still developing into their mid-20s, and that's the part of the brain that's responsible for controlling impulses, exercising judgment, engaging in good decision making. Now, take that lack of a prefrontal cortex and add it to some other things going on physiologically, such as the hormonal flooding. Kids are wired for intense feelings, and not only do they feel things intensely, but they seek out experiences that give them intense feelings. If you know teenagers, they are drawn to drama, and they like to stir up the drama, and things are always more dramatic for a teen than they are for an adult, right? The problem is they are experiencing intense feelings and seeking out intense experiences. They don't have that prefrontal cortex, which is the brakes, the ability to put the brakes on. So they get everything all stirred up, and they don't have the ability to put the brakes on. That leads us to two really key points as we put that together, all right? Research on emotions explains why scare tactics don't work, but why adults who are in the room when they're happening often think they are working. Because teens live in the moment, one, and in an intense assembly or a prevention presentation, many of the youth can become pretty overwhelmed by their emotions, and it makes so much sense that the presenter or other adults in the room are seeing that energy, and they're assuming the message is getting through. And it may be getting through in that moment, but again, there's all this fear, and if there's no resolution, no action steps, no what do I do so this won't happen to me, no further anything, then later at the moment, and even without further things happening, later at the moment of choice, keep in mind that now they're in full sway of the emotions that play in that moment. Later that week, that weekend, a couple weeks later from the actual presentation. And in that moment, there's excitement, there's curiosity or fear of rejection by their peers. All the emotions of that moment reign supreme, and the emotions that happened way back when in that presentation could have been a lifetime ago. Research shows that the emotions during the prevention message do not carry into the moment of choice. So even if we're getting intense reactions from the kids, it doesn't mean they're carrying to the moment of choice. And that's especially going to be important when we look at our more high-risk kids, which is foreshadowing for point 3. All right, now before I tie that together, there's a second point here that goes with the slide you got up. This research is pointing to a really important thing that all prevention education needs to do. We know that youth experience intense emotions, and it's difficult for them to think through potential outcomes when they're at the sway of their emotions. Part of the job of prevention is to prepare them for those moments, not scare them. We have to prepare them. We need to prepare them to make important decisions during moments of intense emotions, and that means skill development, not a didactic presentation full of scare tactics, right? That's not going to get us where we need to be. So my little bumper sticker for this whole presentation is we need to prepare them, not scare them, okay? So as we tie that together, let's add on a third piece here. Our third reason why scare tactics don't work. We know that high-risk youth can be more attracted to the behavior after hearing these messages. So let's explain what a high-risk youth, what that might mean. There are 3 different kind of characteristics or personality traits that are there on your slide. Sensation seekers. If you've not heard that term before, all human beings are on a continuum of how high or low sensation seeking we are. As adults, we tend to be lower sensation seeking than we were ourselves when we were a teen. So on the whole, teens tend to be more sensation seeking. Again, that intense emotion drive, A lot of that's hormonal driven. But some kids and some human beings, even throughout their life, are more wired to be high sensation seekers than others, and it's even more intensive for them than when they're teenagers. And this means that they seek out experiences where they feel things intensely. For me, I love riding roller coasters. I can't ride a roller coaster every day, right? If I like jumping out of planes or being, doing bungee jumping, that's serious risk taking is often very tied to people who are sensation seeking, right? Because they like that more intense experience. But you can't do that every day. But here's this thing called alcohol and other drugs sitting right there that we can access more easily every day, right? So those sensation seekers are already at increased risk. There's so much research tying sensation seeking, which is also why teens are more at risk than later in life, right, as a whole. Add to it that we've got some youth as well as adults that are just more wired to be more impulsive. They make their decisions more in the moment. Again, put that in with a teenager who's already at the sway of their emotions. They aren't thinking as logically. They don't have the prefrontal cortex, and if they're more driven to be impulsive, they're gonna jump into something in the moment much more quickly than remembering something, some warning message from the past. Add to it again if somebody's a risk taker, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. So these can come together. They don't always come all three together, but you can see how they can play off each other in one kid or one human. Combining any one of those three risk factors with an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, as we have in all adolescents through the mid-20s, that's a recipe for even more high risk, right? Now let's tie this together. When high-risk youth hear scare tactics, those warnings certainly trigger all their defenses, and for most of them it's the denial or the skepticism. I've seen people do this and, they're fine. But at the same time, there's this other layer where the danger in the message actually kind of stimulates a thrill. And that's a real important piece that puts them at greater risk. So there's this particular risk if it's a youth who's already experimented and holds favorable views. There's a lot of research on that. If they've already experimented with alcohol or other drugs and they already hold a favorable view, they haven't had a big negative experience of their own, they've had the feel-good experience, which is why kids do it, why adults do it too, right, at least in the beginning. And that more favorable view, the less the warnings are believed. And there's a whole study that's in your citations about the National Marijuana Campaign. You may remember those marijuana ads when they were out, and the research on that is that it backfired, right? It backfired for the young people who already were using and had favorable views. Doesn't mean they were addicted. They've already been experimenting with it, were early in their use, and they had favorable views about it. So the solution to this is we need more positive messaging, and we also need to do more social norming that's positive and present positive alternatives. That would be a better approach, particularly for these high-risk youth. All right? So more positive messaging, positive social norming, and presenting more positive alternatives for them. Let's put this together with our fourth reason why scare tactics don't work, and that's that strong warnings can also send an unintended message. And this was a really eye-opening thing for me when I read this research. If they're getting all this, all the adults in the community or at their school are so wired up, and about a recent crisis with a particular drug, like we have the opiate crisis right now here in Ohio. Wow, the adults seem very concerned about this. Drug use has got to be just a real big problem, and a lot of kids my age must be doing this stuff, and it must be really hard to resist, or why are they coming at us like this with this intense message? So it really reinforces everybody's doing it, and it normalizes the use. So that kids end up believing more peers are doing it than actually are, which means they'll expect less social disapproval if they do it too. And there's a lot of research around that. So the solution, again, is positive messaging, positive social norming messaging especially. For example, our drug-free youth. We need our drug-free youth to be supported and nurtured and fostered to stand up and stop being the silent majority, because otherwise the minority is setting the norm. And every social psychologist will tell you that doesn't make sense. Why on this issue is the minority setting the norm? Because we have a pretty silent majority. So we need to lift our drug-free youth up and really help them take their place as message givers. Just a thought, before we start to wrap up this piece on the research. If scare tactics worked, because they've been tried on all these things on your screen, we wouldn't have any of those issues, smoking or drinking and driving or teen pregnancy or STDs. The reality is prevention is more complex than everyone would like it to believe. There's no silver bullet message. There really is that 6 levels across the spectrum of prevention and tons of research across it that really points to what does work, which we're going to come back to that here by the end. I promise to fold back, but I want to sum up some thoughts on scare tactics first. I'll tell you just my example for me personally. Let me personalize this. Knowing the scare tactics don't work, that doesn't mean that I don't have that initial gut reaction when I see something scary. When bath salts first came out, and I watched a few of those viral videos with people under the influence of bath salts, I was like, holy crap, and we got to get the word out, and, scare them some more, and oh my God, and knowing that they don't work doesn't stop that first natural instinct from coming up. But we have to be willing to pause and know what we know and lean into the research, recognize this human reaction for what it is, and stop and consider the research, and then identify other strategies and solutions. And the key is, when there is a new alcohol and other drug crisis, a new trend, our goal as preventionists is to try to help everybody across our community sectors and every level of leadership, including parents, to be more proactive and not reactive. So when there's a crisis and a public outcry, our job is to help our community leaders and all our helpers channel that focus and energy into increasing the number and quality of effective prevention efforts. A lot of spinning wheels and wasted time and wasted money and attention span of core audiences get lost when we're being very reactive because we ourselves got scared. So we're trying to scare everybody else, right? So if you're looking to develop a message, here's a little test for you. Always looking at the design of your message and asking yourself, is fear the primary element of the message? Can this message stand the test of time? Will this message or the impact of it erode by the light of truth or experience? Will the credibility be gone? Does the message include concrete steps to avoid the problem? And simply saying, so don't do it, is not a concrete step. And really not just the concrete steps, but an opportunity to practice those steps or internalize that. Motivation to not do it, as well as the skills to follow through, right? Or the motivation to make more positive choices and the access and availability and skill development to follow through with those positive choices. We so often focus on what not to do when we could be spreading more around what to do, right, that's positive and healthy. Before we sum up and open this up for questions, I want to take a special side trip here because we get the question a lot about where do personal stories fit in. And I sometimes call these the cautionary tale, right? And we need to beware of the cautionary tale. We have a strong history in prevention from way back in, I believe it was the 60s and 70s, as that federal dollar set aside was being put out, that all the treatment money federally was going all down to treatment, and then they said, nope, you got to set aside 20% of your dollars for prevention work. And treatment folks were the folks doing the services at the time, so they did what they knew. Like, wow, look, over here in recovery and in our treatment programs, we have these folks that are out there in recovery groups, and they tell their lead story all the time. They're ready to tell their story. They've practiced telling their story. They've done it in front of groups before. We could just take them into the schools to do presentations with the youth. And if kids just knew what could happen, then they wouldn't do this, right? Everything we just said comes up, plus a whole lot more. Because the kids that are, seeing that, a lot of them that are high risk are going, well, one, that won't happen to me. I'm smarter than that person. I won't let it get that far. And here's where that person went wrong. And I sure wouldn't become addicted. And sometimes the lead panelists also focus on all the awfulness that led to recovery, and then they barely spend time on the road of recovery. And it makes it sound easy. So kids sometimes get, well, and if I did run into problems, I'd just go into treatment like she did, and then I'd be fine like she is. And they make it seem kind of simple. So there's some unintended messages. Again, what do kids latch onto versus what do adults latch onto when they hear those stories? Kids have a different filter. Adults are thinking if they just knew they wouldn't do it, so let's help them see it. But kids don't process it the same way. Think of the difference between bringing in a recovery panel about here's what happened to me, don't let it happen to you, which we know rarely does any human being take that message well, versus holding up the kids who are making a drug-free choice and having them talk about what motivates them. Why do they choose to be drug-free? How do they maintain that choice day in and day out, even if there's ever situations where they may feel pressure to do something different? Now we're holding up the example that we really want folks to follow, and we're normalizing the healthier choice, right? And they are able to, if adults work with them well, they're able to really convey the message we're wanting other people to internalize. That's the key. That's the key. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for personal stories to fit into prevention, because if you remember, prevention is both a movement and a discipline, right? So we can marry the two together and look at what role personal stories do play. They play a strong role in the movement side of prevention. So as we look back at our spectrum of the 6 levels of prevention, we know based on the research that personal stories of recovery or tragedy that may have hit my own family are not going to be appropriate at level 1 or level 2. So let's work the other way. The best fit for personal stories, absolutely. The pill mills got closed in Ohio because the families got up and testified and told their story and said, if my kid hadn't had such easy access to, then this death would not have happened, right? So influencing policy and getting the attention of not just the leadership, but also the media, right? That's important, because it says this is happening, and it's happening here in our community, and we do need to get ahead of it, right? So changing organizational practices, those personal stories can be part of that environmental change at the organizational level as well, and getting those leaders involved. Fostering coalition and networks, there can be a role for the personal stories there, okay? For most all of these, we're really looking at overall adult systems for the most part. And 4, we can get into a youth group or a youth coalition, so we have to be very cautious on that one. And I want us to be cautious and note the more dotted line here, even at level 3, where we're educating providers, even if that's teachers, because without a warning, the teachers may then go share that same story with their kids out of good intentions and a natural human assumption that that's what's going to work, right? So as a direct service message, not a good fit. As an environmental change companion, tool in the toolbox, can certainly have a role. Though it's not just with kids. I do a lot of drug-free workplace work with adults, and there are no scare tactics in any of our presentations, because this research about how people process fear applies across the ages. I just want to underline that. This isn't just about kids. Let's come back to our storytellers. Some other thoughts, if you've got some folks that are involved with your agency or your coalition that may have a place to tell the story. Is the storyteller ready to tell their story? The recovery rule of thumb is they should have 5 years clean. And a lot of people in prevention don't know that. So we should not pressure, nor should we accept somebody very new and young in their recovery to be out telling their story. It is such a public forum and that pressure that if they relapse, which is a natural part of recovery for almost every drug, at least one relapse is common, and some drugs a lot more. And that's not fair to them in their recovery. It makes their road harder. They need to be standing on solid ground before they do that talking. So what does that mean to families who've experienced a loss? There is no rule of thumb. That 5 years from the tragedy for the families often will feel long. The reality is a lot of them want to get out and share their story because if they can save another person, they want to do that. But we as professionals working with them would do them a disservice if we let them do that too soon. If we provide an avenue for do that, if they have not done the groundwork they need to be strong in their own grief and coping. For example, here in Ohio, we have many family engagement advocacy groups. And there's the story of one mom who, it had been, I think, 6 months, maybe 9 months since her daughter had died. And she was invited to a public meeting and had 10 minutes of the agenda, and it was early in the hour and a half of the agenda. After an hour, she was still talking. She was crying almost the whole time. No one felt they could be the one to go up and take the mic from her and try to change this moment. No one felt they could interrupt that moment. It was a disservice to her and her healing. It was a disservice to the group, and it was a disservice to the goals of whatever the rest of that agenda was. It was way too soon in her coping for her to be doing that. So are they ready to share their story? And do they even want to? Not everybody who's had a tragedy wants to do that. So as we put that together, whether it's a recovery speaker or someone who's experienced a tragedy from a close friend or a family member, it's got to be tied to a goal and never as a standalone strategy or message. And when those folks, if you work with those folks who say, I want to tell my story, how can I be helpful? I feel like my story could help take down barriers to change here in our community. So if you find an appropriate audience and an appropriate purpose, help them work through, who am I talking to? Is my story an appropriate message for this audience? Right? Is it an appropriate audience for my message? Why am I speaking? What's the goal? Is there a call to action? And how does my story fit into a larger comprehensive approach with this target? If this school, if this is all they're doing to check off, we've done prevention, and I'm going in to tell my story in health classes or in a assembly, and that's it. One, I don't think it was an appropriate audience to begin with, and two, it sure can't be a standalone, right? But it honestly was not an appropriate audience for those stories to begin with. Sometimes what we have to do as folks that work in this field is we need to help, especially these family members, feel the permission that it's okay to say no to a speaking request. Here's where that's going to be hard for them. They very often will say, boy, if I could save just one, because they're thinking about their kid or their family member that could have been that just one. The reframe is this message with the wrong audience can backfire, especially with high-risk youth and those already experimenting. What if it backfires with just one? What if it backfires with just one? Give them a copy of the scare tactics document, show them the research, do some conversation, and then help them channel this energy that they want to try to make positive change so it doesn't happen to anyone else. Help them find the right space and place to do that within the community and the work that you and your agency or coalition do. That's a powerful thing you can do for them, but they need some capacity building and training. They also are going to need pointed to some grief support or how to set up a grief support group for other folks like them in their community. We're going to help with that next month. Our webinar next month is about our GAP network, which is moving from grief to action for prevention. That's the GAP network. And so that is next month's webinar topic, where we'll talk a bit more about those groups. If there are formal groups like that evolving in your community, we got some tips from having worked with them for a couple years here in Ohio. So let me sum up on the scare tactics piece. We know that scare tactics can create an immediate temporary reaction that can look promising, but those emotions in the moment do not translate to the moment of choice. We know they can backfire, especially with high-risk youth. We know that these messages create a lack of trust, not only in that current message giver, but in future message givers, if that message isn't matching up with someone's personal experience or with people they know who use. We can create the impression that drug use is more prevalent than it really is, and we undercut a more social norming positive message about the reality that the majority don't do it. And we are also using a lot of time, a lot of money, and taking an attention moment for something that's been found to be ineffective, and that's a waste of precious resources, including people's time and attention. So we need to prepare them, not scare them. And it could be a whole nother webinar about what does work For those of you who are newer to prevention or maybe haven't seen it before, there's a very nice summary that Derek's going to send you in the email that's from NIDA, and it's their 16 principles of effective prevention. And we're going to send you a copy of that with that email. And that, for some of you, could be a great starting place to get more grounded in the larger research. It's a summary, again, of a great deal of research. So let's go ahead and see what questions we have. I'll turn it to Derek. He's been monitoring all the things you guys have been typing into him. So we'll see what Derek has to say.
And thank you, Allison. Hopefully we'll be able to run through the audio without too much difficulty. It seems like we've got that taken care of. The first question is from Ginger, and her question is related to scare tactics. What if they are combined with education about behaviors which they can do to avoid negative behaviors? So scare tactics combined with education about behaviors they can do to avoid using them.
The reason we've got that orange and white striped line on every slide, we have to really, even when it's grounded in a more comprehensive prevention program and approach, be very careful. Again, a scare tactic is more about when we're using fear alone. Sometimes fear is the natural byproduct of telling the truth. How much of our curriculum or our program or what we do is going to elicit fear? And how is that balanced with everything else and all our other messages, including what's positive about making healthier choices and the skill development and all that piece? I would just encourage a great deal of caution, okay? So again, fear can be a natural byproduct of telling the truth, but don't rely on it and minimize how often it's a part of what you do.
And another question, this is related to pledges that students might be asked to sign to not use alcohol and other drugs. Doesn't the looking at scare tactics, doesn't this also kind of go against or argue against the effectiveness of student pledges and things along those lines?
I'm not sure how I see a pledge as being a scare tactic. If it's on the heels of a presentation where we've scared them and then they sign a pledge that says I won't use, I think if a pledge is part of a comprehensive program where kids have been given a lot of opportunity to mull this over and to internalize some personal reasons and motivations to stay drug-free and healthy and the skills to develop that, a pledge can be a nice period at the end of that sentence. So I myself am not seeing the connection to a pledge as a scare tactic. If you've got another thought on that, feel free to jump back in to Derek with that.
And this question is from Patricia. In her experience, the mock crashes reach more of mature teens who are on the fence about whether to join the drinking crowd or not, as it is affirming to teens who decide each day to avoid alcohol or other drugs. She appreciates the presentation and the work and the research that went into it, but from her experience, for the sake of those two groups of teens, she thinks that scare tactic approach can be a valid part of the ongoing prevention process, not just effective for the less mature teens.
Keep in mind that that frontal cortex doesn't develop until the mid-20s, and those intense emotions are in play even for older teens, junior and senior year. I hear you. I know that the people have personal experiences, whether it be a mock crash or other uses of these types of strategies, and it can be very, very a real gut pull that we really think it works. I really encourage you to follow up with a copy of this document and dig into some of this research and rethink what you're doing. That's all I guess I can say is there's research versus personal experience, and the best I can do is try to help get the research out for more folks.
This question is from Tiffany, and it's kind of a loaded one, so be prepared. With all of this research, any idea why the federal government doesn't use scare tactics through PSAs and other messaging that doesn't really support the research?
Getting better. I will say that in the 80s and 90s there were some intense use of scare tactics, like the coma patient that it was later identified it wasn't even an alcohol and drug reason while he was in the coma. You know, they used a lot of lies. They're better than at that. But like even right now that there's this whole thing about putting the graphic warnings on the cigarette packaging. They've already tried that in Europe and found it failed, and yet we're putting money to that. I can't defend the federal government. And there's also sometimes even within states, you know, there's a whole field of people who are certified in prevention and even a master's of prevention science out of the University of Oklahoma and public health and all these folks, it doesn't mean people are aware that there is that science, even if they're in a gatekeeper or leadership role. A lot of those campaigns get designed without consulting the research. It's good intentions on a larger scale with a bigger wallet. It's the same thing that may happen in a smaller community. It's just happening on a larger scale and helps reinforce that scare tactics are the way to go. It frustrates me to no end, as I'm sure it does others on the line.
This message is from Lori. Her prevention team has been asked to speak to high school prom goers 2 days before the prom, and they have 25 minutes to do so. What type of messaging should they focus on, and how should they stay away from scare tactics, or how can they reframe within just 25 minutes 2 days before prom?
Wow. That's a very loaded question, isn't it? Without knowing what else those same youth have already been exposed to that you could be referring to or reinforcing or building on, I don't know that I can design 25 minutes for you on the fly. If you would like to call me and talk about that, our last slide here is going to be my contact information, and we'll be sure to put that up for you in just a second. We got to change me back to presenter here if we can. So let's go ahead and put that up for anyone who wants to make note of that, and I'm happy to talk through that with you. Derek, you got it? You got it. Thank you, Derek. Yeah, again, 25 minutes to do that on the fly. I don't feel like I can be helpful without doing a little more discovery about what's already in play.
This question is from Eileen, and it's related to parents who host Lose the Most, Don't Be a Party to Teenage Drinking. They're getting ready to gear up for the program for the year, and while it's focused to adults, how does the parents who host Lose the Most message stand against scare tactics and be used in a way that's not scare tactic driven?
For adults? For parents? Is that the implication? Well, it's not meant to be a standalone message. I mean, it's out there in the community as to reinforce, but there's so much in the program kit. If you've been a member of our member center or received the program kit in the past, there are so many other things for communities to do that are really the intent of that program, and that public awareness side and that campaign and that slogan is really meant to reinforce and remind of more intensive things that you do. So it's not meant to just be billboards and brochures. We also do a training about that. If anyone's interested, we've gone out to a number of communities to help communities look at how they can use the Parents Who Host program as a more environmental change effort and tie it to the 7 environmental change strategies that Katka also talks about. It's not meant to be its own standalone. It ties in and reinforces to other messaging.
Similar to wanting a recovering speaker to be within or beyond 5 years of recovery into the process because of the normal process of relapse, how do you avoid potential negative consequences of holding up young people who have chosen not to use as examples, since they may at some point in the future experiment at some point?
And that is a really good point, and something I know, having worked in the past in a lot of youth-led programming, that at some point every youth-led program faces, where one of their youth leaders does make a different choice, and maybe in a pretty public way, and then the credibility of the group gets challenged, and they have to work through that. I think that is a fair point. It is something that a youth group would need to work through. I don't know that it means that we don't hold up our youth, and it doesn't necessarily mean through a drug-free panel. You know, there are other ways to do it. You know, we've got at the end of this month over 1,000 youth going to be all down at our State House for a We Are the Drug-Free Majority Day. And I believe the webinar from last month was on our youth-led program, that's available and archived on our website. I'm sure Derek can tell you where. If you're interested in learning more about that messaging, that's more of a group mass messaging and not always just holding up one individual student in a presentation. So you're right, there can be a challenge there.
We have reached the 2 o'clock time period. We will continue with questions, but wanted to wrap up from the administrative and programmatic aspect in case folks need to leave the line. If you are interested in purchasing the Why Scare Tactics Don't Work document, you can do so from our online store at drugfreeactionalliance.org. Again, if you have questions related to the webinar, you can contact Allison at 614-540-9985, extension 19, or A. Scherer at drugfreeactionalliance.org. And to recap again, we will be sending, or I will be sending, copies of the PowerPoint presentation as well as the recorded session and related documentation to you probably within the next week or so once that gets posted to our website. Also, in order to assess the value of today's session and to help determine further webinar topics, a survey will be emailed to you within the next couple of days. We really need your feedback not only for this session, but it also helps drive us to what we'll focus on for the upcoming webinars. So we will continue with the questions that we have, because there is quite a list of them that are on there. Just wanted to make that available. Also, as Allison mentioned, the GAP network, which really focuses on family engagement for individuals who have experienced family loss or family or friend loss related to substance abuse, and how to kind of hone their skills and make them the best advocates and champions for the field that we can. That webinar will be on May 13th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and you can register at drugfreeactionalliance.org/upcoming-events. Now heading back to the questions. The next question is kind of related to student use, but with a different twist. This comes from Amy, and her question is, what is your position on using pictures of local people, specifically youth, who have died from drug or alcohol use in presentations? Is it appropriate, even if the image has been in public forums, and if the family has or has not been consulted?
I can only answer with my personal opinion on that, and I would discourage it. Again, I think it puts the focus on the tragedy. I think it's okay to talk about when a tragedy has happened, but when we put the pictures up, it really starts to smack as that's being the main focus. Without knowing the context of the rest of the presentation, that's the only way I can answer that on the fly.
The next question is from Amy, and she's not really catching what she should be doing. For example, such as the Michigan model, list of research prevention programs, etc.
And that's where I'd refer folks to in the email. Derek's going to send you the NIDA 16 principles. Those 16 principles, we have created a checklist that we have helped work with school districts around Ohio to help them even vet things that come in or are offered, whether they're free or for a cost. And they can have a little checklist to review that kind of curriculum. NRAP already does a lot of that work for us, the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices, and that NRAP website would definitely be something for folks to check into. You've got to be able to have a sense of your community's needs and data and what would be a good fit for your community as well as your capacity, so it can be quite a lot of work. Hopefully, if you're not one, you would be able to hook up with a certified prevention specialist in your area who could help you dig through NREP, which is programs that have been found to be effective and can be used in other settings and communities. So between the NIDA 16 principles, which is an umbrella, and NREP, that's where I would direct folks.
Thank you, Allison. And this question is from Jessica. Do you have a website with resources or brochures that would be useful in elementary school drug prevention programming?
That's, again, a very wide piece. I would recommend NREP, again, as the first place. That's not necessarily going to be brochures. NIDA has some pretty good information. They have a brain power curriculum that crosses a number of ages. That's a science curriculum infusion that is good. It's only a piece of the puzzle. It's not a comprehensive program all on its own. But it does have some interactive components. That said, I'm not as strong of a specialist in elementary prevention. So I would, if you don't know of a preventionist in your area that you might be able to ask that of, please feel free to email me and I'll try to connect you with some resources.
And this question is a follow-up from Brian's original question related to using student pledges. Since the student pledges are disconnected from the moment of decision-making, when the emotions and the lack of prefrontal context development makes this a not very effective strategy.
I think that's a fair point. I think that's a very fair point.
We have local hospital programs where they take kids through ERs and morgues showing healthy lungs and smokers' lungs, showing how some of our decisions have bad consequences while others have positive ones. Are their brains not developed enough for this to have an impact due to them being more impulsive?
What age group was that? Kids. Well, and even again, the prefrontal cortex not fully in place till the mid-20s. That there's also healthy lungs. Kind of balances some, but it's still, it borders very much on a scare tactic. I think it really depends on what else you are wrapping around that, or are you expecting that tour of showing the negative consequences to be the only message that would carry the day and help them to not make that choice. I mean, that really becomes the key. Again, fear can be a natural byproduct of telling the truth, but you want it, if there are negative consequences that you're sharing, it needs to be within the frame of a more comprehensive program and not a standalone message.
And that question was from Charlie. The next was from Elizabeth. I am having a difficult time distinguishing what scare tactics are as opposed to teaching the negative consequences using drugs and alcohol. How can we teach consequences without fear, going to jail, losing driver's license, getting someone pregnant, overdosing, etc.?
I think notice that the examples you just gave are all the more extreme. One, we don't do enough to talk about the more immediate negative consequences that are closer to a kid's day-to-day life that they'll relate to more. And two, are we balancing that with all the positives of making a healthy choice, and are we framing it all with the things we have to do to prepare them to internalize the motivation and then be able to follow through with decision-making, coping, and resistance skills. That's the difference. And so a scare tactic, again, is a moment where someone is giving a scary message in the hopes that the fear alone will make the behavior change or prevent the problem behavior. So sharing negative consequences within the context of all that more comprehensive stuff can have its place and then be balanced. But a scare tactic is when we're relying on the fear alone to carry the day.
Thank you. The next question is from Andrea. What is your recommendation for convincing school administrators that scare tactics do not work, especially when they're convinced they're doing the right thing?
I think the first thing would be for us as preventionists to really internalize this and to fight through it on our own, talk through it with a lot of people. I'm telling you, doing the research to write this document was very educational for me, and I'm hoping, we've gotten feedback that we've done a good job summarizing it into a digestible piece with this document. If that's not enough, we've provided the research references. And then you've got to really think about where are they coming from. You've got to start first with where they're coming from, what their intent is, what their hope is, and that's doing something called discovery. And sometimes the first meeting is about listening. What are their goals? What are their needs? What are their intentions? And then you gently challenge. You know, you find the common ground and then you gently challenge their view with the research, but you got to be ready to replace it with a new view. And here are the things that will meet your goals, and not just short term, but longer term, and not just with this generation of kids, but every next group of kids that are coming through your school. Let's use this opportunity to increase the number and the quality of prevention efforts that are happening with our young people, and there's ways to do it on a shoestring. There really are. So I think you've got to internalize the research so that you can speak from it.
This question is from Mary. Do you believe the younger we can reach these youth, the better chance we have of either scare tactics and education working for a positive future for them?
Not follow that, I'm sorry.
Let me try that one more time. Do you believe that the younger we can reach these youth, the better chance we have of, it says, of either or scare tactics, I guess scare tactics or education working for a positive future for them?
Prevention messaging or program, research shows that we need it to be age-appropriate, developmental, and repeating. So key core ages that are in the research of when they need that message and what kind of skill development, and that is laid out very well in the NIDA info facts document with the 16 principles that Derek has on screen is going to be sending your way. And then it points to the research where there's a lot more detail. What kind of things do elementary school kids need versus middle school versus high school? Really encourage you to dig into that document.
This question is from Angela. What things would you do in a parade to show positive choices to stand against substance abuse if you don't like crashes, crash cars, and gory pictures, etc.?
Well, and especially in a parade, I would hope we wouldn't be parading the crashed car and pictures of blood and gore. I think a parade especially is such an opportunity to be a celebration and a celebration of our drug-free youth. So sharing the data from your local survey into soundbite messages, getting a group of youth with their drug-free T-shirts and a banner. Feel free to co-opt. We don't own it. Co-opt it. We are the drug-free majority. Right? And that's a message developed by kids for kids here in Ohio that is starting to spread nationally. Grab onto some of those kind of positive messaging. That's more of a parade appropriate message to me.
And Brian has two comments. One is just a note of caution related to NREP, that it contains many programs program listings with poorly designed research that is insufficient to warrant recommending those programs to others, including some fear-based approaches. So like with everything, you want to make sure that what you're looking at is appropriate for your community and make sure that it fits, and especially looking at the fear-based side of things. His second point was youth already know the consequences, so a more effective approach to prevention in a class may be to have the students tell us what the negative consequences are, that this change in the activity from didactic information giving to Socratic group discussion, which is more effective in developing youth problem-solving and decision-making skills.
I would balance that. And then how do you follow through?
Said that she would balance out with the positives of not using it to follow through. I had her muted, so I apologize for that.
Sorry.
The next question is from Tamitra. She teaches HIV STI prevention. How can I get them to see the importance of using protection without using the pictures, etc.? I don't use the pictures, however, but I want to show how to become more effective in my messaging of abstinence/condom usage.
Other than speaking generically, because I've never worked in that area of prevention, again, sharing negative consequences, there can be the natural byproduct of telling the truth, a little bit of fear. You got to balance that with action steps to decrease that fear, and that sounds like a lot of what your education is. If you're also sharing condoms with them and teaching them the appropriate way to use them, you're giving them the action steps. Balance in, you know, the value of health, and as well as I don't know if you're also working on the value of delaying that decision to be active, or backing off if they've been active, and what the values of that can be. I again don't know all the context of your program and the goals of your program, but the more comprehensive we can be in our message and not just be about only the negative consequences and the fear, the better off we'll be.
This next question is a comment and question. When educating the adults in our community, we have relied heavily on area experts to talk about the impact of alcohol on the brain development and addiction. These programs always include strategies for how to talk to your kids about alcohol, how to avoid it, and what else you can do. That said, we have received feedback that providing the science of the issue is fanning the flame of fear. Is there something you can recommend we do to shift the feeling that the science is a scare tactic?
Wow, I've never heard that reaction to the science when presenting to parents about the brain development. Maybe it's about how it's being presented, again, without context and being there, because I guess parents, I think the value of that brain research is understanding how your teen is wired, and that some of the wiring's not complete, and there's still an awful lot happening. And that we need to parent them and teach them and meet them where they're at. And it's about understanding your kid developmentally in order to meet them where they're at. So I don't know how it's been framed, and if there needs to be a change in that frame. And again, without doing more discovery and understanding more of this context, I don't know how I can answer this. Again, if you feel there's a deeper conversation that we could have, hopefully you've got my contact information. Maybe we could do a call.
This question is from Maggie. To to clarify, are you saying that scare tactics don't work, or that scare tactics need to be encompassed by a more comprehensive approach to prevention? In other words, they have a place in the presentations, but they're not the be-all, end-all for prevention.
Derek, because we've had this a couple times, can you hit 5, enter, on your keyboard? Go one more. Sorry. All right. Because this is the definition. This is the key. Emphasizing the worst dangers of drug use in order to create fear and anxiety in the hopes that the fear alone will prevent or stop risky behaviors. I understand there is a feeling of a mixed message. I feel it too from the research. There's some reality that you can't do alcohol and drug abuse prevention or good health promotion without sharing some of the negative consequences. The question is, are we only focusing on the worst of the worst? And if that's all we're sharing and we're relying on that to win the day, that the fear alone is going to stop them, that's a scare tactic. There is some reality that within the context of an age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate, comprehensive prevention program design, that we may have part of what we do, including sharing some of the negative consequences of use. Again, I encourage you to look at more than just the most extreme, as well as sharing some of the positive things of making the healthy choice, right? And then you balance all that in with everything we need to do to prepare them and not just scare them. A scare tactic is when we scare them and walk away. We've had folks, especially in reaction to this opiate crisis in Ohio, say, I know how to solve it. Give me a video camera. I'm going to just have these videos, and if we scare them, they'll never do it. If I could just get a personalized video in every community of a kid who's died in their community, they'll never do it again. If that worked, we would have had no drug use in the 70s because there were videos all over the place that were exactly that. We can't rely on the fear alone. That's a scare tactic, okay? I hope that helped.
This question is related to that from Marcella, and I think it's hit on it, but if you'd like to clarify further. When receiving feedback from adults, we have been criticized for not showing images/videos to youth. What is an approach and simple response to explain why scare tactics are not effective?
I would encourage you to take the 4 key points that are in the document and create a simpler fact sheet if you need to for those adult moments and hand it to them and say, you know, just like a CPA is certified to do your taxes right, and just like a lawyer goes through the bar, you know, I'm a certified prevention specialist, or here's my degrees or my background, and I have to do the right thing per the research. And this is what the research says. Now, I'm saying that in a very short and brusque way. You, of course, would not handle it in that way. You've got to meet those parents where they're at, help validate. I know it makes sense that this is what would create change. Right? And we sometimes see even the government putting out things like that, and that can be very confusing. But the research is very clear, and it's very important that we don't waste our time doing things that we know not only don't work, but that can backfire. So that's why we do X, Y, or Z instead. Okay? So you're going to need to internalize this research to be able to speak from it or share it with others.
And Barbara has a question related to NREP. Can you... It's been referred to a few times, but she doesn't really know what it is.
And I'm hoping they changed their name. Was that Barb? She said, Barb, I'm praying that I got it right, because I got to tell you, I honestly always confuse it. It's the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices, I believe. Derek's going to look it up for us like a sweet guy that he is, because it used to have a different name, and I'm always confusing which is current and which is the old one. And it's through SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And Derek's about to put it on screen for you. There you go. The
National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices.
I was right! I'm so excited. Yeah, so maybe Derek can leave that up for just a heartbeat here.
And that website is nrepp.samhsa.gov. We'll leave this up and continue with our questions. What positive messaging can be used with youth and marijuana? From Noreen.
That's like a whole other webinar.
And that's okay if it is.
Yeah.
Because
yeah.
The next question kind of goes along with that as well. And what are the top shoestring ideas for effective prevention?
Yeah, I understand why you guys, after I've taken something away and say, don't do this, it doesn't work, because every time I do this presentation, people want to know what does work. Prevention is more complicated than everyone wants it to be. To design a message and to design a program that meets your target audience needs, you got to get to know your audience and the research and find the right marriage. I don't think anyone can just rattle off, here, use these 3 core messages and you'll be good. They really need to be customized to your community. So I'm not going to dip in and try that.
And we are continuing to look for topics for our upcoming webinars for the next fiscal year, so I think that would be 2 good ones that we could work to fit into that, looking about those areas. So again, when we do our survey and there's additional questions or comments or topics that you'd like to have discussed, please enter those so we can use that for the future. This question is from Kathy. Is there a printout or printable information that tells about the relationship between the frontal lobe development and scare tactics?
There's not a single source. Again, this is me synthesizing a great deal of research into this document. I don't recall there being a single source that ties it specifically to scare tactics. It's about how it ties to sensation seeking and impulse control. There are some references within the document. I'm not going to have them memorized off the top of my head, but if you get the document, you'll see under Reason 2 all the brain research, and there are specific references that tie to the research there. There's no one quick, simple answer to that. It's about synthesizing all the research together.
And how will you use your tactics in the inner city?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Again, as with any community, you need to do the homework to know your community and what its needs are and find the right strategies that marry to it. So I don't even want to assume that every inner city is the same. That would not be culturally competent.
And this final question is from Andrea. Is there a meta-analysis about scare tactics that would summarize all of the research?
Oh, wouldn't that just be the dream? It would have saved a great deal of my time last spring if there had been. I will tell you there are some lit reviews, and there are a few pieces that are a meta-analysis about this kind of this related topics that are part of the citations that Derek's going to send you. I think we'll leave it at that, and as you review that, if you've got some further questions, you know how to reach me. And I don't have a PhD in scare tactics. I just need to go ahead and say I felt the need for us to find an answer to these questions here in Ohio and asked my boss, and they said, yes, put in the time, put in the work. And it was a great deal of reading and synthesizing and researching to try to come up with this document. It by no means means I have a PhD in any of it. So,
and Andrea's response to that is that you should write one and get it published so then you can get a PhD in scare tactics.
Excellent. I wrote the document that we put out. That's about as good as I can go right now, but thanks.
Ginger says, I believe it is important to work with the police department with both positive and negative messages in order to have a complete message.
Yeah, and caution, because the badge do love their scare tactics. And it's understandable, again. Meet them where they're at. They see the worst of the worst. And the adult response is, if they just knew, they wouldn't do this. If they saw what I saw or knew what I knew. So you've got to meet them where they're at and gently challenge that with the research and help bring them on board to another way of looking at what they can do.
This question is from James. He says that he will very much appreciate the information. I wanted to know if there will be a rebroadcast of the webinar so that he might be able to listen to it and or receive any supplementary documentation. Yes, James, we will not be rebroadcasting this session, at least not within the near future. However, we did record the session, and that will be made available to all attendees along with the PowerPoint presentation and the supplemental documentation that can assist you in further identifying scare tactics and effective prevention practices. So that will be available within the next week or so. To Derek's question related to inner city, how would you go into the neighborhood that uses scare tactics? How would you approach them, or what are some recommendations for addressing a community? I don't think it necessarily needs to be inner city, but that is using scare tactics.
I guess it's about finding out who those gatekeepers are of those messages are. And again, internalizing this information and finding a way to meet them where they're at, validate that you understand why they think that is what works, and then gently challenge it with the research, and then help foster a new view for them. That's basic persuasion 101, and it means doing the groundwork. And the start of that groundwork is getting to know them, their goals, where they're coming from, so you can meet them where they're at and help to gently challenge that view. And I got to emphasize gently.
This is from Tina. You mentioned scare tactics being in the UO's Prevention Science Master Program.
Not scare tactics. No, I just happened to mention that there is a Masters of Science of Prevention at Oklahoma, and it's only because I just read a bio from one of the presenters who's coming to our June conference. And it made me go, I want to live in Oklahoma and get a Master's of Science in Prevention. I think public health is a great degree for our field. I think there are a handful of master's programs that are specific to prevention. It's not always alcohol and drug specific prevention. Health ed, health promotion, those are probably the degree programs that match our field the best. That if I could talk to my younger self, I would have me go for one of those types of degrees. I believe that I mentioned that just in response to, I'm not sure where it came up, but I think it's not scare tactics specific. I'll say that.
And then Tina's follow-up question to that, which Angela quickly answered even without even knowing about it, is it available online? And Angela said the Masters of Science in Prevention is online and very affordable. So thank you, Angela, for that.
Oh, thank you, Angela, for that, because I didn't know that.
Lisa has said that Connecticut has a Master's in Community Psychology program that may be helpful. And Angela, in related to cost to the online affordability, said that it's around $8,000 in total. So those are resources that are available, and thank you to all of our community partners that are listening out there that can provide that information, because while Allison is an expert, there are other areas in which she just doesn't know. And I will speak and assume that she doesn't know, because this is completely news to me. Yeah. So thank you for this, too.
We don't have one in Ohio, and we're jealous.
So that is all the questions that we have now. Again, Allison's information is there on your screen, so contact her if you have additional questions. Also, just as a reminder, that our upcoming webinar will be next month on May 13th to really look at the Bridging the Gap network and looking for those who have experienced loss related to substance abuse, providing an outlet for them and making sure that they're empowered to use their voice in the most appropriate way. Because as we know in the prevention field, particularly looking just within the years of development, that just because you have a passion for the cause doesn't necessarily mean that you're knowledgeable and educated about how to express that passion. That's really what this call is going to be about next month, and with what the GAP network is designed to do. So again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to contact Allison Scherer at asherer@drugfreeactionalliance.org or 614-540-9985, extension 19. Thank you so much, and we hope you'll join us next time. Goodbye.